Marlowe Finch sent a letter to a placement agency in St. Louis the same week he fixed the roof on his barn, repaired the north fence line and slaughtered 2 hogs for winter. He did everything in the same order: assess the problem, find the practical solution, execute without sentiment. The letter was 4 sentences long. He needed a woman between 30 and 40 capable of hard work, accustomed to rural life, and not given to unnecessary talking. He signed it in Finch, Harney County, Oregon, and mailed it on a Tuesday without telling a single soul. What the agency sent back 11 weeks later was a woman named Cecily Vance. I have thought about this story for a long time. I have turned it over the way you turn over a stone at the bottom of a creek, looking at what lives underneath. And what I keep coming back to is this: the most important things that ever happen to a person are almost never the things they planned. They are the things that arrive on a Wednesday afternoon with 2 trunks, a skillet, and an opinion about everything. Marlowe Finch had come to Harney County in 1879 with a borrowed mule, a surveyor's map, and the particular kind of stubbornness that runs in men who have nothing left to lose. He was from western Pennsylvania, the 3rd son of a 3rd son, which meant he had inherited exactly nothing, and understood early that what a man wanted, he would have to go out and take from the ground with his own hands. He was not bitter about this. He was practical about it, which is almost the same thing but quieter. By 1887 he had 220 acres of high desert land in the Harney Basin, a good well, a solid house he had built himself over 3 winters, and a small herd of cattle that was beginning finally to turn a profit. He was 41 years old. He had a jaw like a fence post and hands that had been roughened by 8 years of Oregon winters into something closer to bark than skin. He was not an unkind man. He was a man who had spent so long alone that he had forgotten how to be any other way. The nearest town was Burns, 14 miles east. The nearest neighbor was a sheep rancher named Horace Biggs. No, wait. His name was Delbert Oakes. And he was 4 miles north, and not much for conversation either, which suited Marlowe fine. There were women in Burns. There was even a school teacher who had looked at Marlowe twice at the general store. But the mathematics of the high desert were unforgiving, and Marlowe had decided at some point that the agency letter was simply the most efficient path to solving a problem that was becoming, by degrees, unbearable. He did not write the word lonely in his letter. He would not have known how to write it even if he'd tried. Cecily Vance arrived on the stage from Winnemucca on a Thursday in late October 1887, wearing a coat the color of pine needles and carrying, in addition to her 2 trunks, a cast-iron skillet wrapped in a flour sack and a canvas bag that clinked with the sound of glass jars. Marlowe had driven the wagon to Burns to collect her. He was standing outside the stage office with his hat in his hands when she stepped down, looked at the street, looked at the buildings, and said, to no one in particular, "Well, it's flat." Marlowe said, "The mountains are west." She turned and looked at him. She was 37 years old, medium height, with dark hair going silver at the temples and eyes the particular gray of rain coming in off the desert. She had a face that had seen weather and not been diminished by it. She said, "You must be Finch." He said, "Yes." She said, "I'm Cecily Vance. I'll tell you 2 things right now so we don't waste time finding them out later. I don't cook beef on Sundays, it's a family rule and I'm keeping it. And I have a dog, his name is Pocket. He's in the 2nd trunk and he's been in there since Winnemucca and he is not happy about it." Marlowe looked at the trunk. It shifted. He said, "You put a dog in your trunk?" She said, "The stage driver said no dogs in the coach. I said it was either the dog or me and he said the dog, so I put him in the trunk with the blankets and cracked the latch 2 inches. He has air." Marlowe stood with his hat in his hands and looked at this woman who had just informed him, in less than 90 seconds, that she had opinions about Sunday meals, traveled with livestock, and was willing to negotiate with stage drivers from a position of absolute moral certainty. He had asked for a woman accustomed to rural life. He had asked for a woman not given to unnecessary talking. He was beginning to understand that what he had gotten was something else entirely. He opened the trunk. A small brown dog the size of a large boot looked up at him with the particular expression of a creature that has been deeply wronged and intends to remember it. Marlowe said nothing. He lifted Pocket out, set him on the ground and put the trunks in the wagon. Cecily climbed up to the bench without waiting for a hand. Pocket jumped up after her and sat between them. On the 14-mile drive back to the ranch, Marlowe answered 11 questions about the property, the water situation, the condition of the root cellar, and whether he had laid in enough wood for winter. He answered all of them in as few words as possible. Cecily listened to each answer, nodded once, and asked the next question. When they reached the ranch and Marlowe pulled the wagon up to the house, she was quiet for a long moment looking at the building. It was a good house. He had built it himself from lodgepole pine, with a covered porch and glass windows and a proper stone chimney. He had put in a wood floor the 2nd year, which had cost him considerably more than he'd planned. He had been, in some way he'd never examined directly, proud of the house. Cecily said, "The porch is going to need 2 boards on the south end before spring." He said, "I know," she said. "All right then." She climbed down, took the canvas bag of jars and went inside. That first evening, Cecily made supper from provisions she had apparently been assembling since before she left Missouri. She was from a small town outside of Rolla, she told him, where her family had farmed for 3 generations and her father had raised her the way he raised his sons, which was to say with the expectation that she would be useful, and the understanding that useful was not the same as obedient. The meal was a white bean soup with salt pork and cornbread, and it was the best thing Marlowe had eaten since he could remember, which was a longer time than he would have liked to admit. After supper she washed the dishes, dried them, and then sat down across the table from him with her hands folded and said, "I'd like to discuss the arrangement," he said. "All right," she said, "I've come a long way to marry a man I've met once, for about 3 hours. I'd like to be clear about what that means for both of us." She unfolded her hands. "I'll run this house. I'll help with the cattle when I'm needed. I'll put up provisions and I'll manage the kitchen accounts, because I've seen what happens when a man manages kitchen accounts and it is not a pretty picture." She paused. "In return I want to be consulted on decisions that affect the ranch. Not informed after the fact, consulted beforehand. I want Sundays to be mine after the morning chores. Not for laziness but because a person needs something that isn't work. And I want you to be straight with me. If something's wrong, say it. I'd rather know a hard thing plainly than be managed around it." Marlowe had spent 8 years making every decision about the ranch by himself. He had consulted no one. He had managed everything, including the hard things in his own particular silence. He looked at this woman across his kitchen table and felt something shift in the architecture of the room. The way a house settles after a long cold snap and the timbers find their new positions, he said. "I'll consult you. Sundays are yours. And I don't manage people around things." She said. "Good," he said. "I have one condition of my own." She waited, he said. "Pocket sleeps outside." Cecily looked at him for a long moment. Pocket from the floor beside her chair looked up at him with the same deeply offended expression as before. She said, "He sleeps in the barn, not outside." Marlowe said. "The barn," she said. "We have a deal." It was the most words Marlowe Finch had spoken across a table since the winter of 1883, when he had haggled with the cattle buyer from Portland, and that man had spoken enough for both of them. He sat with his coffee going cold and understood that something had changed in his house. He wasn't yet sure what to do about that. He decided to do nothing for now, and see what happened. What happened was this. Within a week, Cecily had organized the root cellar by type and season, patched a gap in the kitchen wall that had been letting cold air in since February, and made a diagram of the spring's drainage pattern that was more accurate than the one Marlowe had been working from for 6 years. He found the diagram on the kitchen table one morning with a note that said simply, "The south channel is backing up before it reaches the stock tank. Needs clearing before freeze. See." He stood there reading it for a long time. He went out and cleared the south channel. She was right. It had been backing up for 2 seasons and he had not quite identified where. He did not say anything about it. But that evening, without planning to, he stopped at the barn on the way in and fixed the loose board on the south stall that had been rattling every time the wind came from the northwest. It was the board nearest where Pocket slept. He did not examine why he did this. He just did it and went inside. Cecily had been in Missouri, the 6th of 7 children, a middle daughter of a family that had very little and held together because of it. She had been engaged once at 24, to a farmer's son who had been decent and steady, and had died of typhoid before the wedding. She had spent the next 13 years keeping her father's household, nursing him through his final illness, settling his affairs, and then looking around at the life she had been building and understanding, with a clarity that surprised her, that it was time to build a different one. The agency letter had been her idea, not her family's. Her sister thought she'd lost her mind. Her brother thought she was being reckless. Cecily had looked at the map of Oregon, found Harney County in the high desert of the eastern part of the state and thought, "That is a long way from everything I know. That might be exactly right." She did not tell Marlowe any of this for some time. She was not a woman who offered herself in pieces, expecting each one to be received carefully. She had learned to watch first and speak when she understood what she was speaking into. What she was watching, in those first weeks on the ranch, was a man who worked from before sunup to after dark without complaint, and without apparent need for acknowledgement, who fed the animals before he fed himself, who had built a house with glass windows in the middle of the high desert, and then lived in it like someone who wasn't quite sure he deserved to be comfortable. One evening in November, she came back from checking on the 2 cows that had been off their feed and found Marlowe sitting on the porch steps in the dark, looking out at nothing. She sat down beside him, not close, just beside. After a while she said, "What do you see out there?" He said, "Nothing much." "Stars," she said. "I grew up where you couldn't see stars like this. Too many trees. I used to think I wanted to live somewhere I could see more of the sky." She paused. "I didn't expect it to feel this big." Marlowe said, "You get used to it," she said. "I don't think I want to get used to it." He turned and looked at her. It was the first time in 3 weeks he had looked at her directly in anything other than a working context. She was looking at the stars. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. He said nothing, but he did not go inside either. They sat on the porch steps in the dark until the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. And then Cecily said, "All right, that's enough stars for tonight," and went in. And Marlowe followed, and neither of them said anything about sitting there then or later. But I think that was the first crack in the wall. Not the words, the sitting. December came early that year, which in Harney County means it came like a verdict. The first storm hit the 8th of the month and dropped 2 feet of snow across the basin in 36 hours. Marlowe spent 3 days breaking trail to the stock, and Cecily spent those same 3 days managing everything inside the perimeter, keeping the pipes from freezing, feeding the chickens in the lean-to, restocking the wood box every 4 hours, and producing from somewhere in her organized depths a pot of beef and root vegetable stew that appeared on the stove every evening as if by natural law. On the 3rd evening, Marlowe came in from the last check on the cattle so cold that his hands would not open properly. He sat at the table and Cecily, without comment, brought a basin of warm water and set it in front of him and went back to the stove. He put his hands in the water. He sat there with his hands in the warm water, and looked at the steam rising and thought about the last 3 days and the last 3 months, and the woman across the kitchen who had arrived with 2 trunks, and a dog and a cast-iron skillet, and had in that time become so woven into the daily fabric of this place that he could not now remember clearly what the house had felt like before her. He thought about the chart of the south drainage channel. He thought about the porch steps in the dark. He thought about how she had said, "I don't think I want to get used to it," about the stars, and how that sentence had been living in some quiet part of his mind ever since. He took his hands out of the basin. He dried them on the towel she'd left beside it. He said to her back, "Thank you." Cecily turned around. In 3 months on the ranch he had thanked her twice. Once when she'd fixed the wall gap. Once, now she knew this because she had been, in a way she hadn't quite admitted to herself, keeping count. She said, "You're welcome, Marlowe." It was the first time she'd used his given name without the context of a sentence around it. Just the name standing alone. He looked at her. She looked back. Then she turned back to the stove, and he got up to hang his coat, and neither of them said anything else. But something had happened in the room that had not been there before, and they both knew it, and neither of them was quite ready to say so. The hard thing, the thing that actually broke them open, happened in January. Marlowe had a bull that had been with him since 1883. A red roan he'd bought as a calf from a rancher in Idaho and raised himself. The bull's name was Cedar. He was 8 years old and had been the foundation of Marlowe's small herd, and was by any reasonable measure, the most valuable animal on the property. In the 2nd week of January, Cedar went down with a joint infection that the vet from Burns identified as serious, and that, after 4 days, became something worse than serious. Marlowe spent those 4 days in the barn. He slept 2 hours at a time, came in for meals he barely tasted, and went back out. Cecily brought food to the barn on a tray and left it without comment. She took on his share of the work without being asked. She did not offer opinions about the prognosis, because she understood that what a man needs when something he has raised is dying is not information but company, and she gave him that in the only form he would have accepted. The form of being present without demanding anything. On the 5th night, Cedar died just before morning. Marlowe came in at first light and sat at the kitchen table and did not speak. Cecily set coffee in front of him and sat down across from him, and they were quiet together for a long time. Then Marlowe said, "I raised him from 6 weeks old." Cecily said, "I know." He said, "He was a good bull. He was a great bull. I watched him work the herd. He knew what he was doing." Marlowe put both hands around the coffee cup. He said, "I'm going to need to rebuild the bull stock. I have a neighbor in Lake County who has a line I can work from. It's going to take 3-4 years to get back to where I was." Cecily said, "Then we start on that in spring." He looked up at her. She said, "You've been running this ranch alone for 8 years. That's why it took 8 years to get to where you were. 2 people is faster." She met his eyes. "I'm not going anywhere, Marlowe." He looked at her for a long time, and then something in his face, which was ordinarily about as expressive as the side of the barn, shifted. "Not much. Just enough." He said, "I know." Those 2 words from Marlowe Finch were approximately the equivalent of a long speech from anyone else. Cecily understood this. She nodded once and got up to refill his coffee and did not make anything more of it, which was exactly the right thing to do. But the next morning she woke to find a rocking chair on the covered porch that had not been there before. A proper rocker, made of oak with a flat back and wide arms and a level of craft that suggested Marlowe had been working on it for some time. There was no note. There was no explanation. Cecily stood in the doorway in her coat and looked at the chair. She sat down in it. It fit her perfectly. Which meant he had been paying attention to something she'd never said out loud. She sat there in the January cold for 15 minutes, in a chair that was somehow exactly the right chair, on a porch that was starting, in ways she hadn't expected, to feel like hers, and something inside her that had been held in place by the careful habits of a woman who had learned not to expect too much began quietly to let go. She did not say anything to Marlowe about the chair that day. But that evening, for the first time since she'd arrived, she played music. She had brought a small concertina in the bottom of her second trunk, wrapped in a wool sweater. She had not played it in front of him because she hadn't been sure of the space. The way you are not sure of a room until you've lived in it long enough to know its acoustics. But that evening after supper, while Marlowe sat at the table with the ranch ledger, she took the concertina out and played. Nothing fancy. Just a reel she'd known since childhood, something her father used to whistle. Then a hymn. Then something slow that had no name, that she'd made up herself one winter when her father was sick, and the nights had been very long. Marlowe did not look up from the ledger, but he stopped turning pages. When she finished, the room was quiet. Outside, the wind pushed against the north wall. Pocket, who had been allowed incrementally closer to the house over the previous 2 months, and now slept just inside the back door, lifted his head and then put it back down. Marlowe said, still looking at the ledger, "What was the last one?" Cecily said. "I don't have a name for it," he said. "You wrote it?" She said, "Made it up one winter when I needed something to do with my hands besides worry." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Play it again." She played it again. And this time he closed the ledger. I think that was the moment. Not the chair, not the basin of water, not the porch steps in November. Those were the approach. That was the arrival. They married on the 14th of February 1888, which was Cecily's idea, and which Marlowe agreed to with an expression that suggested he found the date somewhat sentimental, but was willing to live with it. The ceremony was performed by a circuit judge named Aldous Price, who arrived on horseback in a snowstorm, and performed the ceremony in the kitchen in front of the wood stove, with Pocket present and Delbert Oakes from the next ranch over serving as witness, a role he performed with approximately one expression, which was the same one he used for all occasions. After the judge left and Oakes rode home, Marlowe made coffee and Cecily cut the cake she had baked that morning, which was a walnut cake with a brown sugar glaze from a recipe that had been her grandmother's. They sat at the kitchen table and ate cake and drank coffee and did not make any speeches. At some point Marlowe said, "I'd have married you in October if you'd wanted." Cecily said, "I know, but I wanted to know you first." He said, "Do you know me?" She looked at him across the table. She said, "You fix things you didn't break and you don't say why. You feed the animals before yourself every morning. You built this house with glass windows in the middle of nowhere because you wanted something that let the light in, even though you wouldn't have said it that way." She paused. "You made a rocking chair and you didn't leave a note because you didn't know how to explain it, so you just made it and hoped I'd understand." Marlowe was quiet for a long time. He said, "Did you understand?" She said, "I sat in it for 15 minutes in January cold. What do you think?" He looked at her. And then, for the first time since she had stepped off the stage in Burns 4 months ago and told him the mountains were west, Marlowe Finch smiled. It was not a large smile. It was the kind of smile a man produces who has not used that particular expression often and is slightly surprised to find it still works. Cecily looked at him and thought, "There he is. There is the person living inside all that silence," and she thought, "I came out here expecting to work hard and be useful. I did not expect to find someone who would make me feel known." Marlowe and Cecily Finch ranched in Harney County for 39 years. They rebuilt the bull stock in 4, which was Cecily's timeline and not Marlowe's, because she pushed harder than he would have, and turned out to be right about what the operation could manage. They had 3 children. Cecily taught them all to read from a set of books she had brought from Missouri, and supplemented each year from the catalog. Marlowe taught them all to work before they were tall enough to see over the fence rail. The rocking chair stayed on the south porch until the porch itself needed replacing, and then Marlowe built a new porch and moved the chair to it, and it was still there 30 years later, smoother from use and missing one arm spindle that no one had ever got around to replacing, because by then the imperfection had become part of it and no one wanted to change it. The concertina was played every Friday evening for as long as Cecily's hands could manage the bellows. Marlowe never learned to play it, but he always stopped whatever he was doing to listen. Cecily died in 1931 at 78 years old, in the house that Marlowe had built with glass windows to let the light in. Marlowe died the following spring. He had, as far as anyone could tell, simply decided there was no particular reason to stay. He is buried beside her on the east slope of the ridge above the ranch, where they could both see the basin all the way to the mountains. He sent for a wife because it was the practical solution to a practical problem. She arrived with a cast iron skillet, a dog named Pocket, and a concertina she didn't play for 3 months. And what they built out of all that practicality was something neither of them had known they were building until it was already half finished. I have thought about this for a long time, and here is what I keep coming back to. Marlowe never said he was lonely in that letter. He couldn't find the word, and Cecily never said she was looking for someone who would make her feel known, because she hadn't let herself want that yet. They came to each other with practical reasons and careful terms, and a dog that wasn't supposed to be in the trunk. And somewhere between the south drainage channel and the rocking chair and a song with no name, they found something that neither of them had thought to ask for. The best things usually work that way. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer. There's a moment in this story, one specific moment, where Cecily stopped watching Marlowe and started trusting him. Not the chair, not the basin of water, not the February wedding. I think you know the moment I mean. Tell me in the comments. I want to know what you saw. And if this story stayed with you, if you've ever built something alongside someone else, and only realized later that you were building it together, there's another one just like it waiting for you right here.